It started the way most things that end badly start, with a kind of quiet sweetness that you don't realize is a trap until you're already caught. I was 22, a senior at a university in California, and my life was a neat little package. I had a boyfriend, Mark, who was the picture of stability. He was a year older, working in finance at a firm in downtown LA, and he drove a sensible silver sedan and wore sensible blue suits. He was the kind of guy you take home to your parents, the kind you build a future with, and for 3 years, that's exactly what I thought I was doing. We had a small apartment in a complex in the valley with a shared pool and a parking spot that was always just a little too tight to get into. It was safe. It was predictable. It was, for all intents and purposes, everything I thought I wanted. My mom had married Mark's dad, Richard, a few years before. It was a second marriage for both of them, a late-in-life romance that bloomed after they met at a wine tasting event. They were the quintessential blended family, even if it was a little awkward at first. Richard had a son from his first marriage, a son I'd only met a handful of times at holidays and formal dinners. His name was Ethan. He was a year younger than me, and in my mind, he had always been this quiet, slightly brooding figure who seemed to exist on the periphery of our family gatherings. He was an artist, a sculptor, and he had this intense way of looking at things, like he was seeing a version of the world that the rest of us were too busy to notice. He lived in a converted warehouse downtown in a space that was more studio than apartment, and when he came to our parents' house in the suburbs, he always looked a little out of place, like a wolf in a room full of golden retrievers. I never thought much of it. He was my stepbrother, an awkward label that made me feel weird and formal, but he was harmless. Then everything changed. My mom and Richard decided to go on a cruise to Alaska for their 5th anniversary. It was a long trip, 3 weeks, and they asked Ethan if he would house sit for them. They also asked me to pop in and check on things to make sure the mail was collected and the plants weren't dying. It was a simple arrangement. But Mark was going on a business trip to New York the same weekend they were leaving, and I found myself with a house to myself and an empty apartment. I volunteered to stay at the house for the first week to keep an eye on things, a transparent excuse that fooled no one, least of all myself. I told myself it was just to get a break from the city, to enjoy a quiet house with a yard and a pool. A little respite from the concrete and the traffic. The first few days were uneventful. I'd arrive in the late afternoon after my classes, let myself in with the key, and wander around the silent house. The air smelled like my mom's lavender candles and the faint, lingering scent of Richard's coffee. It was peaceful. Ethan was there, of course, tucked away in the guest room he'd claimed as his own, which was actually the old study. He was polite but distant. We'd exchange a few words, mostly about the house or if the mail had come, and then he'd retreat to his room. I didn't mind. It was a comfortable silence. It was on the third night that the texture of our relationship shifted. I had been sitting by the pool, my feet dangling in the cool water, scrolling through my phone. Mark had sent a few texts from New York, quick missives between meetings, but he was busy and I felt the familiar hum of quiet loneliness. I heard the back door slide open and turned to see Ethan walking out. He had a sketchbook tucked under his arm and a bottle of wine in his hand. I remember thinking how incongruous it was, him with the wine, because in my mind he was still a teenager. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low and a little rough. "Something like that," I replied, just trying to decompress. He sat down on the lounger next to me, not too close but close enough. He poured a glass of red wine and offered it to me. I hesitated. I wasn't a big drinker, especially not alone with a guy I barely knew, but it felt churlish to refuse. I took it. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the crickets and the distant hum of the freeway. "What are you drawing?" I finally asked. He hesitated, then turned the sketchbook around. It was a drawing of me, not a detailed portrait, but a rough, angular sketch of a woman sitting by a pool, her silhouette reflected in the water. It was beautiful, but it was also strangely intimate. It was like he'd captured a part of me I didn't even know I was showing. My stomach did a weird little flip. "You make me look lonely," I said, trying to sound lighthearted. He didn't smile. "Maybe you are." We were just inches apart, his arm brushing against mine on the armrest. It was nothing, a bare whisper of skin against skin, but it felt like a live wire. The air around us seemed to thicken, charged with an unspoken tension. I looked up at him, and for the first time I really saw him, not as my stepbrother or Richard's son, but as a man. He had Richard's dark hair, but his eyes were his mother's, a startling shade of gray-blue that seemed to see right through everything. I was suddenly acutely aware of the fact that I was wearing just a thin t-shirt and shorts, that my hair was a mess, that I hadn't put on any makeup. I felt exposed. I broke the spell first, clearing my throat and standing up. "I should probably get some sleep," I said, my voice a little too high. He just nodded, his eyes still on me. "Good night." I practically fled back inside. I closed the door to my old bedroom and leaned against it, my heart hammering in my chest. The feeling wasn't of disgust or even guilt, not yet. It was pure electric thrill. It was a feeling I hadn't felt in years, that dizzying, terrifying, exhilarating feeling of being on the precipice of something forbidden. I told myself it was nothing. It was just a late-night conversation. I was projecting. Mark was gone and I was feeling neglected, that was all. But the image of that sketch of the lonely girl in the pool was burned into my retinas. He saw me, and that was the most terrifying part. The following days were a strange, dangerous dance. We were like two planets that had suddenly been thrown into the same orbit, attracted by a gravitational pull we couldn't understand. The small talk became charged. A casual hand on the shoulder as he passed me in the hallway lingered for a fraction of a second too long. Our eyes would meet across the breakfast table and hold, a silent conversation passing between us that neither of us was brave enough to speak aloud. Mark called every night, his voice tinny and distant through the phone. He'd tell me about his meetings, about the steak dinners, about the boring client he had to entertain. I'd listen and make the appropriate sounds, but my mind wasn't there. My mind was in the kitchen with Ethan, watching him make pasta from scratch, his hands kneading the dough with a casual grace that was strangely hypnotic. It was a Friday night when the wall finally crumbled. It had been raining all day, a rare, heavy downpour that turned the backyard into a muddy swamp. Mark was coming home tomorrow, and I knew this strange bubble we were in was about to burst. There was a desperate quality to the air, a sense of last-chance urgency. We were sitting on the floor in the living room, a half-empty bottle of whiskey between us, listening to the rain hammer against the windows. I was talking, I don't remember about what, but the words just seemed to spill out of me. I was nervous. I was talking too fast. He wasn't listening to my words. He was staring at my mouth. "You know we shouldn't be doing this," I whispered, my voice lost in the howl of the rain. "I know," he said, his voice thick. It was an admission. He knew, I knew, the entire universe knew. And for a terrible, beautiful moment, we both decided we didn't care. He leaned in and kissed me, and it wasn't a gentle, hesitant kiss. It was deep, hungry, and full of all the frustration and desire that had been building for a week. He tasted like whiskey and something else, something wild. My mind went blank. All the careful plans, the sensible future, the boyfriend who was a perfect match on paper, it all dissolved in the heat of his mouth. It wasn't like with Mark. Mark was soft, considerate, and clinical. Sex with him was loving, but it was also a routine, a schedule. With Ethan, it was primal. We were barely off the floor before he was pulling at my clothes, his hands rough and urgent. I remember the scratch of the living room rug against my back, the cool glass of the whiskey bottle against my hip. It was frantic and messy and utterly, completely consuming. It was sex you have when you don't care if the world ends, because in that moment it feels like it just might. And when it was over, we lay in a tangle of limbs on the floor, panting, the rain still pounding outside, and I knew with a sickening certainty that I had just crossed a line I could never uncross. The guilt didn't hit me right away. It was there, a dull ache in the back of my mind, but it was muffled by the sheer, terrifying joy of what we had just done. It was a secret, a beautiful, terrible secret. He held me on that floor, tracing patterns on my skin, and we talked all night. We talked about real things, things I had never told anyone. He talked about his mother's death, the pain of watching his parents' marriage fall apart, the loneliness he carried around like a second skin. I talked about my dad, a shadowy figure who left when I was 10, and the pressure I felt to be perfect, to build a stable life to compensate for all the instability I'd witnessed as a child. In the quiet of that rainy night, I realized something terrifying. I was falling in love with my stepbrother. It wasn't just a physical attraction or a momentary lapse in judgment. There was a profound connection there, a meeting of souls that felt more authentic than anything I had ever experienced. With Mark, I was always performing. I was the good, supportive girlfriend, the responsible future wife. With Ethan, I was just me, broken, scared, and alive. The next morning, Mark came home. He came straight to the house to pick me up, bringing a bag of souvenirs and a weary smile. I hugged him, and the scent of his aftershave was so familiar, so safe, that it almost broke me. I looked over his shoulder and saw Ethan standing in the doorway of the guest room watching us. His face was unreadable. I couldn't look at him. I packed my things, kissed my mom goodbye, and got into the car, feeling like a traitor in my own skin. The next few weeks were a masterclass in deception. I had always thought of myself as a truthful person, a terrible liar. But I discovered a hidden talent for it. I learned how to make my voice sound normal when I was screaming on the inside. I learned how to smile and nod while my mind was racing with a million forbidden thoughts. Mark and I fell back into our routine, but it felt like a straitjacket. The love was still there, the fondness, the comfort, but it was like a photograph of a meal when you're starving. It wasn't real. Ethan and I couldn't stay away from each other. We found secret ways to meet. He'd call from a payphone, or I'd text him from the bathroom at work. We'd meet at his studio, a grungy loft downtown that smelled like clay and turpentine. The physical part was still explosive, but it was the after, the quiet conversations on his lumpy couch that I craved the most. We talked about running away, about disappearing to some faraway place where no one knew who we were, where we weren't stepbrother and stepsister. We created a fantasy world, a bubble where the rules of society didn't apply, and I lived in that bubble as much as I could. But reality was a jagged rock always just beneath the surface. My mom would call, gushing about how wonderful Richard was, and I would smile and nod, hating myself. Mark would look at me with such love and trust, and I would look away, my throat tight with shame. It was Mark's anniversary surprise that did it. We had been together for 4 years. He planned a weekend getaway to a little bed and breakfast in Napa Valley. He was so proud of himself, the way he'd arranged it all, the winery tours, the romantic dinners. He was trying so hard, and the harder he tried, the more I felt like a monster. It was the second night of the trip, lying in the dark in a beautiful room with a four-poster bed, that the bubble finally burst. He was holding me, whispering about our future, about the house he wanted to buy us, about the kind of wedding he imagined. "I want to spend the rest of my life with you," he murmured into my hair, and in that moment I couldn't pretend anymore. It wasn't a decision I made, it was an avalanche of truth that just poured out of me. I started to cry. I pulled away from him, the tears streaming down my face, and I just told him. I told him everything, the late-night conversations, the kiss by the pool, the night on the living room floor. I told him about Ethan's eyes and the way he made me feel alive. I spared him no detail because I felt I owed him that. I needed him to understand that I was a broken, selfish human being, and he deserved so much better. The look on his face is something I will never be able to erase from my memory. It wasn't just anger, it was devastation. It was a complete and total collapse of his reality. His face went white, then red, his eyes wide with a kind of shock you see on people who have just witnessed a car crash. He didn't scream, he didn't get violent, he just stared at me, his body rigid. "Ethan," he finally whispered, his voice hollow, "your stepbrother this whole time?" I just nodded, sobbing. I couldn't speak. He got out of bed, his movements stiff and robotic. He put on his jeans and a t-shirt, and he walked out of the room without a word. He was gone for an hour. I stayed in that bed, curled in a ball, shaking, waiting for the world to end. When he came back, he didn't look at me. He packed his bag, his hands trembling. "Don't come back to the apartment," he said, his voice flat and dead. "I'll send your stuff." And then he was gone. The door clicked shut, and I was alone in a beautiful room in Napa Valley. It was the loneliest place I had ever been. The fallout was nuclear. It didn't take long for Mark to tell everyone. He called my mom, and I can only imagine the conversation. He called Richard. He probably called his mother, his sister, everyone he knew. The family that had been neatly blended was now shattered into a million pieces. My mom was hysterical. She couldn't understand how her daughter could do this to her, to Richard, to the family we had built. The worst part was the silence of Richard. He didn't scream, he didn't yell. He just stopped talking to his son. He stopped answering our calls. He had lost his wife's trust and his son in one fell swoop, and the man I had grown to love as a father figure looked at me like I was a stranger, a villain who had come into his house and burned it to the ground. Ethan and I were together after that. We had to be, we had lost everyone else. He moved out of his studio, and I moved into a tiny, grimy apartment in a part of town I'd never even been to. It was our fortress, our pathetic attempt to build a life on top of the ruins of the old one. But the fantasy was over. The bubble had burst, and now we were just two people trying to survive in the wreckage. Without the secrecy, the thrill, the taboo, the relationship changed. It became real, gritty, and mundane. We were broke. I couldn't find a job in the field I wanted because the economy was tanking and all my old references had dried up. Ethan was struggling to sell his art. Our love wasn't a refuge anymore, it was a prison. We started fighting. We fought about money, about the future, about what we had done. There were moments of tenderness where he would hold me and tell me it would be okay. We would promise each other that we were all we needed. But the anger was always there, simmering just below the surface. He started to resent me. He saw the way I looked at Mark's old friends on social media, the way I talked about the life I used to have. I started to resent him. He had broken my life, and for what? For a love that was now just a struggle for survival? The guilt, which I had managed to suppress during the affair, came back with a vengeance. It was a constant companion, a whispering voice in my ear that told me I was a terrible person, that I deserved every hardship I was facing. The final blow came a year later. I was in the grocery store trying to stretch a $20 bill to feed us for a week when I saw them. Mark was there pushing a cart, and walking beside him holding his hand was a woman. She was blonde and gorgeous, and she was pregnant. Very, very pregnant. He was laughing at something she said, his arm draped protectively around her shoulders. He looked happy. He looked light. He had moved on, and he had built the life he always talked about, the house, the wife, the baby. He was doing it with someone else. I felt like I had been stabbed in the chest, all the pain I had caused him, the devastation I had wrought, and he had survived. He had thrived. And I was standing in the canned goods aisle, a ghost in my own life, clutching a box of macaroni like it was a life raft. I ducked behind a display of soup, hidden from his view, and I watched him for a minute longer. I watched the life I could have had, the life I had thrown away for a forbidden spark that had long since burned out. After that, I went home to our tiny apartment. Ethan was there sitting on the floor in his underwear, trying to repair a hole in the wall we had made in a fight the week before. He looked up at me and I could see the worry in his eyes. "What's wrong?" he asked. I told him. I told him about Mark and the pregnant girlfriend. I watched as his face crumpled, the guilt, the shame, the anger all flaring up at once. We didn't fight. There was nothing left to fight about. We just sat in the silence, two broken people, strangers in our own lives. A few weeks later, Ethan was gone. He didn't leave a note. He just packed a bag and left while I was at my dead-end waitressing job. He went back to the city he came from, to his old friends, to try and piece together the life he had abandoned. I couldn't blame him. I couldn't blame him at all. The thing we had created wasn't love, it was a toxic reaction, a spark that caught fire and consumed everything in its path, including ourselves. We had fallen in love with the idea of breaking the rules, with the thrill of the forbidden, and when the thrill was gone, all that was left was the debris. I'm still in that apartment. I'm writing this from the kitchen table, looking at the hole in the wall that he never fixed. It's a metaphor, I guess, for what's left of my life. I don't talk to my mom anymore. She can't forgive me and I can't ask her to. Richard is a stranger. I see Mark sometimes in passing in a car or on the street. He never sees me. He's a ghost in a world that I don't belong to anymore. People will say I was young, that I made a mistake, but that's the easy way out. I wasn't young. I was 22. I knew exactly what I was doing. I made a choice, a series of choices that shattered the lives of everyone I loved. I wanted to be seen. I wanted to feel alive, and I tore apart my world to find it, and I found it for a while. I found it in the heat of a kiss in a rainstorm, in the secret conversations in a clay-stained studio. But it was an illusion, a beautiful, terrible illusion that I paid for with everything I had. Now I'm just trying to figure out who I am without the title of a good daughter or a loyal girlfriend. I'm trying to find myself in the ruins of who I used to be. It's a lonely process. Some nights I still think about the way he looked at me by the pool, the way his voice sounded in the dark, but I don't think of it with longing anymore. I think of it with a profound, heartbreaking regret. Love can't be built on a foundation of betrayal. It might feel like it in the moment, but eventually it crumbles. And when it does, you're left holding the dust. That's my story. It's ugly and messy and it doesn't have a happy ending, it's just the truth. And sometimes, in the middle of the night when I can't sleep, I still reach for the cold side of the bed for a warmth that isn't there. I reach for the ghost of a love I destroyed, and I realize that I'm the one who has to live with the consequences. I'm the one who has to learn to forgive myself. It's a long road back from where I've been, and I'm not sure I'll ever find my way, but I'm still walking. That's all you can do, isn't it? Just keep walking even when the path is gone.